Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the last of TTA's summer sessions. And today I'd like to welcome Lisa Haycox, who's going to be talking about the journey to lifelong learning. So I'll pass over to Lisa now, and she can get started.
Thank you very much. So real delight to be here, and I didn't realise I was the final one of the sessions, but hopefully we can finish on your summer series on a high. I am Lisa. I am COO of Explore Learning, which is a maths and English tuition centre business. That was typically our legacy. And now we are supporting children across both our learning centres across the UK. And we're also supporting children across our sort of online virtual business as well, supporting children between the ages of 4 to 16 with their maths and English. I have had the great privilege of working in the business just over 20 years now, and started life as a tutor in our Peterborough centre, and then have had the wonderful privilege of working my way through lots and lots of different roles, and I currently support the business as COO. So lifelong learning is absolutely within my heart in terms of my own personal journey. And I think we have a real responsibility of how that shows up for the children and learners and the young people that we're working with. So this is absolutely core to me and what we're about to Explore Learning in terms of how we support children on that journey to become lifelong learners, and also our people and tutors and colleagues that we work alongside. So a real topic that I get very excited and animated about, and I hope to share over the next sort of 45 minutes a little bit of inspiration of how we could think about it, how you guys are thinking about it in terms of your businesses, your provisions, so that we are, collectively thinking about how we move this area forward. So why is it important? Why am I so passionate to be speaking about this area? And what is lifelong learning? I more or less bet, or I'm betting on the fact that the people on the call, and hopefully the people that watch this back, are they themselves committed to being lifelong learners. I think in this sector and in this industry, I've already got a thumbs up, we have to be, because things are constantly changing and evolving, and the people that we're working with and the people we're supporting are changing and evolving. And so in terms of what lifelong learning means, I think we've got a real responsibility to bring this to our services and be more than just the subject-based tuition that perhaps people initially see us as. So in my career, the only reason I've been able to do some of the things I've done is because I've had a wonderful network of people around me, both personally and professionally, who've supported that lifelong journey. And hopefully you guys are thinking about that too, in terms of your pathways that you've had in the industry, and thinking, yeah, there was that person or that individual who made a real difference to me being able to do things that I never thought was possible. And I think how we start to think about how we shape those journeys for our learners and people that we work for is really important. In terms of what it is, I'd love if people, there's only a small group of us, but maybe in the chat box, maybe people could just think about, in terms of what you think lifelong learning is and some of the skills and things that show up, what are just some of the words that come to mind in terms of what you believe lifelong learning really looks like? If people just pop a couple of things in the chat box, that would be really helpful. Thank you so much. Always open to learning new skills. Absolutely. Thank you. Willingness to learn all things, Daniela. Wonderful. Curious. Yes, that curiosity to, look under that stone and figure out what comes next all the time. Desire to challenge yourself. Yes, new perspectives, critical, open. It's almost like you've written a presentation. This is wonderful. Look to others for best practice. So these are absolutely the things that mean you've got those skills to be a lifelong learner and open to lifelong learning. I think with lots of the learners that we start to work with, in terms of whether they start with us when they're 4 or 5 or when they come into us when they're 13, 14, 15, quite often, I think what a parent is looking for is the next exam or the next academic year. We're all going into this huge period right now where we'll be talking about the new school year and what we want to achieve. And sometimes perhaps we're missing the skills that those learners really need to allow them to look beyond the next exam, to get them to think about beyond what's going to happen with that grade. And I think it's really important in us and in our sector and what we do as tutors that we've got this really precious opportunity to create skills in children and learners that are going to carry them beyond those next academic milestones. It's going to carry them beyond the next exam. And the reason why it's important is it's a little bit depressing, but this work that Linda Gratta's done, who I was very lucky to meet on a course I did with London Business School, she's written a whole book around your 100-year life. We're all going to live, apparently, to be 100 years or older. And so our careers are going to be 60 or 70 years. We're going to be changing jobs, changing career direction. We're going to look at having to learn new skills all the time. And therefore, with all our children that we're working with, these lifelong learning skills, I think, are critical. I don't think they're optional. I think we're setting up children to thrive if we can support them to develop these skills as we're helping them with the subject tuition that we do as well. So I think we're all on board in terms of why it's important. What does that actually really mean in terms of how our provision shows up and in terms of how we offer each of our different tuition propositions? And we all know, I know in each of the places that we're all working and supporting children, that we will talk about individualization and we'll talk about personalization. And we will all think about very, very carefully about how we unlock each child's potential. And I think what we tend to do sometimes is we focus very heavily on the academic progress, because that is absolutely why initially families may be coming to us. It may be what they're looking for in terms of results and outcomes. But how can we start to switch that to think about the individualization that we need to put in place to develop those lifelong learning skills? We know that each child that comes into us is starting from a completely different place in terms of their starting point with those skills. Have we got a child that perhaps has never been willing to ask for help, or that child or learner who absolutely can't cope with getting anything wrong? And so us looking at our provision and starting to think about, well, what's the individualization that we can put in place, not only to think about the academic progress, but also to start thinking about that lifelong learning. And I think if we can get to a place where we can start to really think about individualizing that for each child on a one-to-one level, then we really do start to achieve this goal of moving forward children to become these really rich lifelong learners. So I like to keep things quite simple because I think we can overcomplicate things quite a lot. And so when we're thinking about unlocking lifelong learning, we really start to think about, well, how do we get to know what that child really needs in the first place? How are we starting to reflect on what that child can and can't do with those skills that you guys all started to put in the chat? And what we do is that tends to be both from the feedback from the parent or carer, but really crucially, it's that observation and seeing how that child interacts in that very first meeting with us. Okay. And I think it's only when you can put those two things together that you start to say, well, what's our starting place? Where is this child starting from in terms of their learning skills? Now, we'll all have met learners where that is really, really at a low base. And I think what we have to do in those instances is try and meet the bridge the expectation gap between potentially what our parents and carers are asking for in terms of our expectation of academic progress or what we want to achieve in the timeframes, from clearly where a child has a big learning gap before we can get those learning skills going and that learning foundation, and then we'll be able to accelerate the academic progress. Now, I think there is sometimes a friction there, and that can be something that can be quite challenging to navigate. However, I think our responsibility is to try and navigate that gap in order for us to then get that child on the right sort of pathway, because I think if we're not, there can be this friction between what the child is ready to achieve with the skills that they've got to be that lifelong learning, but also from a parent's perspective, you know, what they're ready to achieve. Or obviously if we work in schools as well, there could be that expectation gap. How are we measuring progress? So when we talk about progress and where a child has moved from that starting point, what are the key things that we're seeing to where we are now? We quite often talk about progress in terms of academic progress. You know, how much have they moved up? You know, how many in our industry, in our businesses, how many skills are they mastering? You know, where have they moved up? What does that look like for lifelong learning skills? It's harder, okay? It's more difficult to make that tangible, but it's absolutely critical that we are thinking about that, both for that child to say, look, you absolutely couldn't have done this stuff before. You know, you wouldn't have raised your hand in class, or you wouldn't have been able to rethink that question previously, or you would have had a meltdown if you got that wrong. Because now we're only 2-3 months on, and look what you can do. You just asked for help, or you just went and found that out yourself, or you looked that up in the dictionary. You never would have done that before, because we know if we're showing children where they're succeeding, they'll stick with it. They'll go, that's the thing I need to do, because then the next time I get that thing wrong, I'm going to be able to go away and find that answer myself. So how are we measuring progress in our organizations, and how are we making that really, really visible in terms of how we're demonstrating progress? And when we're demonstrating progress, I think that's really important to demonstrate it to the learner, to the parent, or to the carer, or the organisation, I suppose, if we're working with schools or other organisations, but also within the organisation. So I'll go on to that in a second. For our tutors, or for people that are directly working with our learners, how are we demonstrating progress in these skills as well as academic progress? I don't know if I just want to pause there, whether anyone's got any questions or thoughts. Again, pop them in the chat around maybe how you're doing this in your organizations, or some things that you've seen work or not work, or any questions for me on, I suppose, these 3 key steps. Okay. I'll push us on. I think one of the areas that we don't potentially speak so much about in the tuition sector is the joy of learning, and how much responsibility we have for unlocking that joy. we talk a lot about in teaching, I think, about role models and the impact that role models have on being these champions of lifelong learning. And I think in our sector, we're just doing this brilliantly, and we need to shout about it even more in terms of how much we are unlocking the joy of learning and the power of us being the role models for these children and being their ultimate champion, and nurturing that growth mindset. So when there was a recent survey that Natural Literacy Trust did back in 2022, and they were looking at role models and the impact they had on children reading. Maybe let's just pop in the chat box who you thought children said were their role models. 90% of them said they had a role model, but maybe people could just pop in the chat box. Who do we think those role models were that they maybe highlighted as someone in their life that was a role model? Jacob, I love that. Got a literacy author. Role model attitude towards learning. Yeah, absolutely. Interestingly, or what I found interesting was about 65% to 75% of the children said their mum or dad was their role model, which I found really interesting. My word is very niche. Okay. And maybe you could unmute and just explain who that is. I would love to hear a little bit more about that.
Okay, so I won't go on. This is a bit of an obsession of mine. It's Philippe Petit. So basically, I'll just put it there. So he did the wire walk between the Twin Towers, and it's just such a fabulous story. And it's something that when I first heard it, I just couldn't get over. I just thought it's just an amazing story, right from start to finish. He dreamed of doing it before they were even built, and then years later when they were built and he was of an age, he was able to do it. It's just a fabulous story. So if you don't know it, Philippe Petit.
There you go.
Man on Wire is the film.
Love it. Great recommendation. Thank you so much. I think for those children, what was really interesting, it was mum or dad. So it's people who were in their immediate circle, and they were somebody that was forming a role model for them. Or it was somebody who were footballers, or weirdly, around 15% of them, it was a hairdresser in the recent thing, or YouTubers were over 50%. Okay. Now, how could our tutors be these role models for these children, which just take them to a different place? It helps them to dream bigger. And how do we encourage our tutors and people who are tutoring to see that really as a big responsibility? Because I think we've got such power in being those role models for those children and making it clearer some of the skills that our wonderful people in the organisation have got. So how do we free up the space? And it's something I've been really, really thinking about with new tutors that we're bringing into the organisation. How do I give tutors enough space that they can have that precious time with children, which is absolutely going to be the majority of the time focused on teaching and learning, but also that little pockets of time where we can talk about them and what they've done and how inspiring that is to then take that child on a slightly different journey and unlock that little bit of something, that little nugget in terms of, wow, I could be just like, or they've done this thing and they couldn't do this before. So I think that sometimes means that within a large organization, or maybe if we're looking at our one-to-one tutoring, us thinking about our structures and how we allow that space for some of this stuff to happen, because that's not going to be measurable on a report. It's not going to be, reportable in terms of looking at some of the things and the other metrics. But is it going to make that real difference between that child developing those lifelong learning skills and having that real passion and that joy for learning? I absolutely think it does. And I think as leaders in organisations, we've got a real responsibility to enable those things to happen, and for the people that we're bringing into the organisation or want to become a part of the tuition sector, to say, look, big responsibility here. You know, you've got this opportunity to be able to shape how this child feels about learning in the future, and it is beyond bringing your subject expertise and your knowledge. So how we put a framework around that in terms of how we're recruiting our tutors, how we're inducting them, how we're bringing them in, all around our mission, I think is absolutely critical. I then think the parallels, which I've been very passionate about, having had this journey within the organisation, of the skills that I encourage in our learners and our children, they're exactly the same thing that I encourage with our colleagues and our staff. So all the things that we put in the chat at the beginning of the call, I do expect them to ask, yes, another thumbs up there, thank you very much. They're the same things. If I'm doing fearless learning, and we call it fearless learning at Explore, if I'm expecting you to encourage your children to be fearless learners, how you show up on a day-to-day basis and show that you're not afraid to get things wrong, show that, oh, I don't know the answer right now, but I think I can go and find that out. You get this whole cultural, real cultural dynamic where it flows through the whole organisation, and that has to come from the leaders all the way through. So it's something we talk about a lot. Go and find that out. Go and speak to such and such. You know, you got that wrong. Don't worry, it's something we'll know for next time. And I think, again, that's something for us to really think about across the industry and across the organisation, because if we're saying we're doing that with our learners, how's that showing up with the people that we're working with every single day? And it has to be an every single day thing. It has to be every single learning session, tuition session, every time we're meeting with our teams, every time we're interacting. How does that show up? It can't be just something that we talk about. We've got to live it. So how do we drive that continuous improvement? If we are saying this is really important, number one, we are saying that, then how do we set out our structures for that to happen? And then how do we drive continuous improvement in these areas? Because it's not the same as having, you know, in our learning system Compass, we have how children are working on their maths and English. We can have lots of rich data, you know, lots of clever people doing lots of data analytics. This area isn't quite the same. And so we are relying on lots of sentiment and feedback from both our children and our parents and carers and our colleagues that we work alongside. So we put a lot of emphasis on that. And we really look at our net promoter feedback once every 3 to 4 months. And I would say we are obsessive about our net promoter feedback, as I'm sure other people are as well. And we're looking for key markers, not only of where we're succeeding, but we look at every single comment that people are giving us, and we're thinking about how that tallies back to what our promise is to families that join us and learners that use us. So if we're setting out what our promise is, how is that coming through in our net promoter feedback? And we share that across the whole organisation. At a centre level, we share that with each of our centres, with individuals that are working there, both all of the positive feedback to reinforce and say, keep that going. That's absolutely great. You know, keep going with it. But also if there's ones that are negative, okay, what's the lesson learned here? Why do we not feel that is landing as well as it should be? So we do really focus heavily on the feedback and our net promoters. We also get feedback from our learners, from a RAG rating after every session. And that's whereby children will be rating red, amber, green on certain things. And if we see, obviously, if that's shifting in any of our sessions, then we will work with that centre quite quickly in terms of why we think that is. We'll do more observations with them. And then something that is really critical to our lifelong learning skills is every child has their own fearless learning habit. So when they join us as a member, we will, between the family and ourselves, we will agree what that child's fearless learning habit and starting point is. So normally that will be, is it around their confidence? Is it around their ability to ask for help? Is it around skills around distraction, concentration? We'll agree that with mum and dad and the child, and then we review that and get feedback around that every time we have a progress meeting with them. So we will tend to always get feedback around what are they seeing at school. So it's always that linked up between what we're seeing, what the parent's seeing, and what the child is seeing, to see us always move that forward. In terms of insights, what we then have to do is pull that all together to say, okay, well, how are we doing as an organisation? And as an organisation, then I need to be able to pull that into key themes and insights that I can be able to say, it looks as if we're doing a really great job, maybe with these fearless learning habits around curiosity or asking for help, but actually we've got a little bit of a gap over here in terms of concentration or confidence to speak to others. And so it's only really by pulling those things together that we can start to have the insights that then we can filter out through our team. So once we've pulled those into key themes, then I can start to work with different teams in the organisation to say, look, how's this showing up? What do we need to change here? Is there something in our training and development that needs to happen with our people? Is there something with our internal communications we need to look at to tweak this a little bit? And for me, again, it's across the whole organisation and across the team that I want everybody to feel that's a responsibility. That's not just a responsibility of our education team or of the product team. It's really a responsibility of everyone in the organisation that we are developing these lifelong skills in our children and in our learners. And I would say we've made real progress with that, but that is a continuous thing across the organisation that we continue to work on to drive that forward. And I think that's a sort of endless quest, really. The final thing that I would really share on this area in terms of continuous improvement is to share the successes. We have, over the course of time, we've had tutor awards ceremonies, and we've had member nominations for people who have really made the difference to them becoming lifelong learners. And we've had video submissions of parents and children saying, this is the tutor I've worked with, and these is the real difference they've made to me. And the reaction from our tutors across the organisation has been extraordinary. So we had a ceremony, we get a video that we share of the winners, and then we share those across the teams. And it really has been such a celebration of what we do, and then that keeps that all really going in terms of celebrating why we do what we do and why we feel that lifelong learning is so important to all of the people that we work with. So there is really, get the feedback, see what's actually happening, get the feedback not only from parents and carers but from colleagues and from the children that you work with. Turn that into insights that you can package up across the whole organisation, and then celebrate the really wonderful work that you're doing. Keep anchoring back to why lifelong learning is so important, because in amongst everything, and at this time of year, it is absolutely, I know, really, really busy time of year for all of us in this industry, but if you have to keep anchoring back to those key lifelong learning points in order for it to stay a focus of the organisation. So I'll just pause there and just see if there's, I suppose, any other conversation points or thinking points that anybody in the group would like to sort of raise in terms of questions or ideas that we want to delve into a little bit more. I'm quite happy if people want to pop them in the chat, or there's only a small group of us if anybody wants to open up any questions. Do you want to unmute, Helen, and we can... There you are, we can see you. Hi there.
Yes, hello. Hello, Lisa. Yeah, thank you. What I'm thinking is, this is I'm really loving this, and it's the whole thing of lifelong learning. I hadn't thought of in terms of like the job of tutoring, if you see what I mean.
Yeah.
I thought of it as like, yeah, something I agree with and would think about, but I hadn't thought of applying it directly. I mean, I would be called a sole trader apparently. So I just tutor individuals.
Mm-hmm.
After having worked at a tutorial college, which I loved, but that work is no longer available. So I'm doing it myself. So I'm sort of getting back to it. So it's fairly new to me, really. And I'm thinking, in terms of advertising, how I'm and going from there, how I might introduce it into that, into, you know, when you're just doing one-to-one work.
Yeah. And what age range do you work with, Helen?
Well, ideally, I mean, my favorite is A level.
Mm-hmm.
Second is GCSE.
Okay.
After that, I have other students, but I you know, I don't feel as confident because that's, and also it's not my choice actually to work really with younger children. So yeah, I'd rather target the GCSE and possibly A level. Yeah.
Yeah. So I think what we found from this, and this is an area I'm really passionate about, is that I'm sure all of the things that we've talked about show up in the way that you're tutoring with encouraging some of the skills. But in terms of advertising, marketing, there are probably like skills to help them thrive to learn or enhance their learning. Phrases like that we've found resonate with parents. I think when we've done a lot of research into what's the problem parents are trying to solve when they initially start looking for the tutor, they're not looking for lifelong learning skills when they start that search.
Yeah.
They're thinking the problem I'm trying to solve is I'd really like them to get a grade higher or this in the next academic year. And what we found is once they understand life learning, they go, oh, yeah, of course I want them to have all those things. But that's not the first reason they're searching initially for a tutor. That's all our learning has been, is once they get into it and we get a conversation going, they say, yes, please. Initially, when they're doing that first search, that's not the problem they're trying to solve. Would be our experience. So I would just play with that with your advertising and see what resonates and what doesn't resonate.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. That makes sense. And you had a phrase, fearless learning, which I thought was nice. And I thought, if that's okay to use that just in, you know, in ordinary language, that would be, yeah, that would be great. And of course, the joy of learning. So that's wonderful. Anyway, thanks a lot, Lisa.
That's okay. Well, hopefully it's given you some things to think about, that slightly different perspective of what you're doing. I think it's really interesting.
Great, thank you.
You're welcome.
And there's also one question in the chat as well, Lisa, from Daniela.
Ah, okay. The ultimate between the balance between the learning and the academic progress. Gosh, if anybody's solved that, I would love to hear it, because it feels, an ongoing battle, I think. And obviously with some of the curriculum and the national curriculum and the sheer volume of content that we need to be able to cover, and also meeting the needs of lots of different learners now, and some of the needs that I've seen really shifting in terms of supporting children with lots of different needs, the anxiety they're feeling about learning, and some of the the mental health things that we're supporting children with associated with learning really feels like that's shifted quite a lot in the last few years. I would say, you've got to be able to have both. And I think, just going back to the point we just had that interesting discussion with Helen, we are predominantly working with parents and carers who support their children to come to us. And I think it's understanding what the problem they're trying to solve initially is, and working with their needs, and then supporting them to see the benefit of lifelong learning alongside that. So I would start with understanding what the parent believes the need to be, work on that expectation gap between, I understand what you're telling me right now, however, I think if we were to work on their learning skills, we would be able to accelerate their academic progress. So you have to do both. I think it's understanding children and their individual needs, that then you can see about the weight that maybe needs to be put on each of those things. I think it's an ongoing conversation that we will continue to have in education. Daniela, I don't know what you think about that.
You confirm my struggle with this thing. It's a very complex process, and
It is.
need to keep an eye and to have always the Lord in the front.
Yeah.
To get there. Yeah.
And I think the most important thing is it part of the conversation? I think it's great that it's a part of the conversation, and it continues to be part of the conversation, and that conversation is not going to go away. But it's there is the most important thing.
All the time. Yeah.
Great.
Thank you.
Okay.
And Anne's also just popped a question in the chat as well, Lisa.
Is there a strategy around engaging reluctant learners? Yes, I would say, first of all, what we would do with our engaging reluctant learners is, sometimes it's getting them to engage at all, right? It's just give this a try. Just give me 15 minutes. So that's normally where we will start, is really having quite an in-depth session with the parent beforehand to try and learn everything that we can, and then at least trying to get 15 minutes to half an hour to at least get them in and trying. We would always be looking predominantly at the relationship with those learners and the trust. For me, I think it comes back to how much can we get them to trust the person that they work with. And once we get the trust, then we can start working on all the wonderful things we've spoken about for the last 45 minutes. But if that trust isn't there, I don't believe that we're going to start making the progress again, and really understanding what level we would need to start them from. So quite often, again, expectation setting with their family, it may be that we have to start from a lower level than that parent ever thought we would need to. But in order to rebuild their trust and their confidence, that's the foundation that we need to start with. And sometimes that can be quite a tricky conversation really to have with that parent in terms of what's the starting point. Then get the trust and the relationship with the tutor and the team, and then we can start to do the work. And I saw you nodding there quite a lot when I said trust, so yeah, I'm sure that shows up in your organisation too. Great. Absolutely. I hope that has given you some sparks, some thoughts in terms of maybe just a little bit of a shift or a nugget of something in your organisations or your tutoring, and how this shows up. It is an area I continue to be extraordinarily passionate about. If it's an interesting conversation that any of you would like to continue, you can very easily find me on LinkedIn or anywhere like that, and feel free to get in contact. I'm very, very happy to talk about this subject or any others. Yeah, that's sort of it from me. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Lisa. Did you want to pop your email address in the chat here, just so if anyone does have any questions afterwards, they can get in contact with you? And if anyone's watching this back on our YouTube channel, you can get in contact with me if you have any questions for Lisa, and I will pass your questions on to Lisa and she can then respond directly. So that brings an end to not only today's session, but all of the summer sessions we've had throughout July and August. And I'd like to say a big thank you to everyone, and especially today for Lisa for a really, really interesting presentation. And thanks everyone for attending as well and engaging. It's always great to have some really, really interesting questions asked. So I'll leave it there. Thank you very much. Enjoy the rest of the summer, and we look forward to seeing you soon.
Thank you very much for having me. Really enjoyed the conversation. Thanks very much, everybody. Take care. Bye-bye.
Thanks, Lisa.